It's a special kind of cold when your own blood is the one who locks you out of your life. My name is Rachel Vance. My father didn't just leave me a business, he left me the Vance family cidery, the heart of our small Oregon town. I'd poured my entire life into that land, into those trees. But I never saw the rot inside my own family. I trusted my uncle. Now a single industrial padlock is all that separates me from my father's legacy, and a soulless corporation is ready to pave it all. They've stolen my name, my future, but they don't know what I'm willing to do to get it back. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The air was thick with the smell of pressed apples and wood smoke, a sweet, sharp perfume that meant October in Liberty Creek. This was my element, the annual Harvest Fest. Our biggest day of the year was winding down, and the golden hour light was slanting across the orchard, turning the rows of trees into a cathedral. I wiped a smudge of pie filling from my cheek and grinned at Mrs. Gable as she waved her arms full of cider donuts. "Best one yet, Rachel," she called out. My chest swelled with a familiar, easy pride. This wasn't just a business. It was my father's legacy, and it was the heart of our town. I did a final lap, my boots crunching on the gravel path. The band was packing up their bluegrass, fading into the happy murmur of the crowd. I'd personally managed every vendor, tasted every new batch of our limited-run Harvest Gold cider, and shared stories with at least a dozen people who'd known my dad back when this was just a 10-acre patch and a dream. At 28, I was the undisputed heart of Vance Orchards. I knew the trees, the people, the process. My father had left the books to his brother, my uncle Marcus. It was a partnership that on paper worked perfectly. I made the cider, he made the deals. As the last families trickled out, their kids sticky with caramel and sleepy from the hayrides, Marcus strode to the small wooden stage we'd set up by the main barn. He commanded attention. Where I was, all flannel and worn denim, Marcus was sharp lines and expensive wool. He looked more Portland boardroom than Oregon farmer, a fact he seemed to cultivate. He raised his glass, the setting sun glinting off his designer watch. "To another incredible year," his voice boomed smooth and practiced. The remaining staff and townsfolk cheered. "To the Vance legacy." He paused and his eyes found mine across the yard. I smiled, ready to raise my own glass, but my arm froze. His smile didn't reach his eyes. They were cold, appraising. "And," he continued, his gaze pinning me, "to the hard decisions it takes to protect it." The words landed wrong, like a sour note in a perfect song. It wasn't a toast. It felt like a warning, or a justification. A few people clapped, but the energy had shifted, pricked by an invisible needle. He stepped down, all charm again, clapping his head, brewer on the back. But I couldn't shake the chill that ran up my spine. Hours later, the grounds were silent. The moon was high and cold, bathing the orchard in silver. I was in the farmhouse office, the one my dad had built, its walls lined with faded photos of prize-winning apples and grinning Vances. I was locking the old roll-top desk, the day's receipts bundled and ready for the bank drop, when the crunch of tires on the long gravel drive made me look up. It wasn't a local truck. It was a black, immaculate SUV, the kind that looks armored with tinted windows that drank the moonlight. It pulled to a stop right in front of the porch, its headlights cutting sharp, invasive cones into the darkness. I watched, my heart suddenly knocking against my ribs, as Uncle Marcus emerged from the shadows of the main barn. He hadn't gone home. He walked to the SUV, not like he was greeting a guest, but like he was reporting for duty. The passenger door opened and a woman stepped out. She was tall, dressed in a severe dark suit that seemed to absorb what little light there was. Even from 50 yards away, I could see she was all hard edges and zero warmth. She was Ms. Jenner, though I didn't know her name yet. They didn't shake hands. She spoke, her head tilted, and Marcus just nodded. Then she reached back into the car and pulled out a thick manila envelope, the kind used for legal documents. It was sealed. She handed it to him. Marcus didn't look at it. He palmed it, a quick, almost furtive motion, and slipped it inside his expensive jacket. He said something, and she gave a single, sharp nod. They shared a look then, not of celebration or success, but of cold, quiet conspiracy, of a deal concluded. Ms. Jenner slipped back into the SUV, the door closing with a heavy final thud, and the vehicle reversed its red taillights, disappearing down the drive. Marcus stood alone in the darkness for a long moment, his back to me. He didn't move. I stayed frozen by the window, the old wood of the sill biting into my palms. The silence of the orchard was absolute, but in my head a siren was screaming. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, as unripe cider frost, settled deep in my stomach. That night, standing in the heart of my father's legacy, I knew with a certainty that defied all logic that I had just watched him sell it. I didn't sleep. That cold, creeping dread from the night before had coiled in my stomach and stayed there, a physical weight. I was in my truck before the sun had even thought about rising, my headlights cutting through a low-lying fog that clung to the fields, making the familiar drive feel alien. The dread solidified, becoming heavy and real when I saw the gate. My headlights didn't hit the familiar rattling old chain. They hit something new, a thick industrial-grade padlock gleaming with an oily metallic sheen, and parked just inside a white generic sedan with a security logo I'd never seen in Liberty Creek. The car door opened and a man in a stiff, ill-fitting uniform stepped out. He was built like a refrigerator, and his face was a blank, tired mask. "Property's closed, ma'am," he said, his voice muffled. "I'm Rachel Vance." I said, my voice sharper than I intended, the cold morning air stinging my throat. "I own this place. Who are you?" He didn't answer. He just reached into his jacket and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. He pushed it through the iron bars of the gate. "I was told to give this to you." My hands were shaking as I unfolded it. The paper was cold crisp. It was covered in dense legal type. My eyes struggled to focus, but they found the words. Notice of sale. Transfer of management. Effective 600 a.m. "No," I whispered. It was a reflex, a denial. Then past the guard down the long drive, I saw it. Parked by the main barn, right where he always parked it. My Uncle Marcus's gleaming silver truck. He was here. "I don't know what this is," I said, my voice rising, shoving the useless paper into my pocket. "But I'm going in." "Ma'am, I can't let you do that," the guard said, taking a step toward the gate. I didn't listen. Adrenaline, hot and sharp, flooded my system. 10 feet to my left was the low fieldstone wall my great-grandfather had laid by hand. I ran for it, scrambling over the moss-slicked stones, ignoring the guard's sudden angry shout. "Ma'am, you're trespassing! Trespassing!" The word was so absurd it barely registered. I landed hard on the wet grass, my boots sinking into the mud, and sprinted toward the barn. My heart was a hammer against my ribs. I rounded the corner of the big red barn, the one where I'd learned to drive a tractor, and skidded to a stop on the damp gravel. There he was, my Uncle Marcus. And he wasn't alone. Ms. Jenner, the woman from the SUV, stood beside him, her severe suit looking even more alien in the gray morning light. 2 other men, both in identical dark suits, held clipboards and were looking at our bottling line like it was livestock. "Marcus!" My voice cracked, echoing in the too quiet yard. "Marcus, what is this? What's going on? Who are these people?" He flinched, a small guilty movement, but he didn't turn. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the stainless steel vats. "It's done, Rachel," he said, his voice quiet, dead. "I saved us." "What are you talking about?" Ms. Jenner turned, her face pale, her features sharp. "Ms. Vance, I presume." She didn't wait for an answer. "Mr. Vance has enacted a valid power of attorney signed by his late brother to sell the assets of Vance Orchards, LLC, to Global Bev Corporation." She checked her watch, a cold, precise movement. "The sale was finalized an hour ago. Your presence is no longer required. Global Bev. The name hit me like a physical blow, the soulless conglomerate. They were the monster my dad had always fought against. Power of attorney. I looked at Marcus desperate. He couldn't. That was just in case something happened to him. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes terrified me. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't regret. It was resentment. A deep, cold, simmering resentment I'd never seen before. He trusted me, Rachel. He spat the words like venom. He trusted me to make the hard decisions. What hard decisions? I yelled, my voice breaking. I just saved his legacy from the hole you were driving it into, he said, his voice rising to match mine. We were bleeding money. You and your little passion projects, your community days, your refusal to expand. We were drowning. It was a lie. A bald-faced, sickening lie. I'd seen the books a month ago. We were profitable. Solid. That's not true, I whispered. The wind knocked out of me. We were fine. It's irrelevant. Ms. Jenner cut in, tapping a file she was holding. She pulled out another sheet of paper and held it out. I didn't take it. Furthermore, she said, her voice monotone, the terms of the sale include a 5-year, 50-mile non-compete clause binding on you as a principal operator. She let that hang in the air. You will cease and desist all operations related to the production or sale of cider, effective immediately. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. They hadn't just sold my business. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They had stolen my name, my work, my future, my hands. They'd cut off my hands. No. Am I up there? I started to move toward Marcus, toward the office, toward something. The security guard from the gate had come up behind me, his radio crackling. He put a heavy hand on my arm. Ma'am, you need to come with me. Now. Get your hands off me. I twisted, my eyes locked on Marcus. Marcus, don't do this, please. This is Dad's life. It's my life. He just looked at me, his face a mask of indifference. He turned his back. Get her off the property, Ms. Jenner said, not to me but to the guard like I was a stray dog. The guard's grip tightened, and he began to pull me away, half dragging me back across the wet grass, back toward the stone wall. I looked back one last time. Marcus was adjusting his cuff. He wouldn't look at me. It's just business, kid, he called out over his shoulder, his voice hollow. The guard shoved me through the gate and slammed it shut, the new padlock clicking into place with the sound of a cell door. I stood there shaking on the wrong side of my own life, locked out. I don't remember driving to the Liberty Bell diner. My truck just sort of ended up there, parked crooked in the gravel lot. I was sitting in a corner booth, the red vinyl cracked and familiar, but my hands were wrapped around a coffee mug I didn't order, and I couldn't feel the heat. I was just staring out the window at the town's single stoplight, blinking red, red, red. The diner was the nerve center of Liberty Creek, and I could feel the news spreading like a virus. My phone, sitting dark on the table, suddenly lit up, then again and again. A cascade of texts. Rachel, what's going on at the cidery, from my head brewer. Heard a rumor you sold from a neighboring farmer. The new gate is locked, I can't get in. Rachel, from my taproom manager. Each message was a small, sharp jab reminding me this wasn't a nightmare. It was real. I'd been locked out. My staff, my friends, my whole team. They were locked out too. They didn't know they were already fired. I heard the whoosh of the diner door and the jingle of the bell. And then Maya Torres slid into the booth opposite me, her leather satchel thumping onto the seat. She'd been my best friend since we were 5, and where I was soft earth and apple blossoms, Maya was granite and barbed wire. She was the smartest person I knew, and thank God she was a lawyer. She didn't say, I'm sorry, or, are you okay? She just looked at my face, then at my phone, which was buzzing frantically again, and her own face hardened. He didn't, she said. It wasn't a question. He did, I whispered. My voice sounded thin like a stranger's. Global Bev, he sold all of it. He He had power of attorney. He said I was driving it into the ground. He said he was saving it. Maya's eyes narrowed to slits. That's a lie. Your dad's POE, she said, already thinking her legal mind spinning up. It was standard. It was built on trust. It gave Marcus fiduciary duty, which means he legally had to act in the best interest of the company, not in his. She grabbed a napkin and uncapped a pen. But he's claimed he did it to save a failing business. That's his cover. That's the legal shield. We have to prove he's lying. We have to prove he acted in bad faith. Right now, Rachel, that document is ironclad. He exploited your father's trust and he used it as a weapon. I know we were profitable. I said the words feeling useless. How do I prove it when he's in the office and I'm here? Before she could answer, the diner bell jangled again. Ben Carter stood there, silhouetted against the bright morning. Ben was a man made of oak and quiet loyalty. He'd been my father's best friend and our orchard manager for 30 years. He looked like he'd aged a decade since I'd seen him 2 days ago. His eyes, usually crinkling with a quiet humor, were red. He walked over to our booth and slid in next to me, his heavy frame a comforting, solid presence. He put his large, calloused hand on the table. He's a damn liar, Rachel. Ben said, his voice a low rumble. I just got the email. Your services are no longer required. After 30 years. Ben. My voice broke and I finally felt tears hot and sharp. He's lying. Ben repeated, his voice harder. We weren't failing. I just ran the final numbers for the festival. We had the best September in a decade. I didn't want to say anything before Rach. It wasn't my place, but Marcus has been different ever since your dad passed. He leaned in, lowering his voice, though the rest of the diner was already straining to hear. He's been taking out secret loans, using the cidery as collateral. I've seen the letters. They're not from our local bank. They're from some high-interest lender in Portland. I went to see him about it last month, about needing new equipment for the North Orchard, and he got ugly, told me to stay in the fields and leave the books to him. Maya had stopped writing. She was staring at Ben. Loans for what? Ben looked down at his hands. I heard things in town from some of a crew he used to run with. He has debts, big ones. Card games up in Portland. He's been gambling. Big. The air in the booth went cold. It clicked into place with the sickening finality of a lock, the resentment in Marcus's eyes, the expensive watch, the lie about us bleeding money. He wasn't bleeding us. He was bleeding us dry for himself. He hadn't sold the cidery to save it. He'd sold it to save himself from the people he owed. He'd sold our entire legacy, our family's history, my father's life's work to cover a bad hand at a poker table. Oh my God, I breathed. That's motive. Maya said, her voice a low, vicious hum. That's breach of fiduciary duty. That's fraud. But we need the paper. We need the real ledgers, not the ones he's cooked. As she said it, her laptop, which she'd opened on the table, pinged. She'd been scanning the county clerk's website. Her face went pale. Rachel, Ben, you need to see this. She turned the laptop around. Global Bev isn't wasting time. They just filed an emergency petition with the county planning board. It posted 10 minutes ago. My eyes scanned the document. Application for emergency zoning variance, Global Bev Corporation, Project Cider Mill. Then I saw the blueprint, the schematic. It showed our entire property, but the main barn, the tap room, the farmhouse office. They were all gone. And the orchards, the 100-year-old heritage trees my great-grandfather planted, they were just gone. In their place was a single massive gray rectangle. They're petitioning to demolish the heritage orchards and barns, Maya said, her voice flat with horror. All of it. They want to build a 200,000 square foot bottling super plant. They're going to level our history and pump out cheap, artificially flavored crap with our name on it. The betrayal was no longer just personal. It wasn't just my staff or my inheritance. This was a direct existential threat to the town. That plant would pollute the creek, it would kill the skyline. It would gut the soul of Liberty Creek. They can't, I said. The zoning, the historical protections. They're counting on steamrolling us, Maya said, clicking through more files. They've called a special town hall meeting. Tonight, they're going to discuss the zoning. They think they can flash a little money promise, a few dozen low-wage jobs, and get it rubber-stamped. They're counting on Marcus to get up there and sell the lie, to tell everyone how he had to make the hard decision. Tonight. It was all happening tonight. We were out of time. I looked at Maya, then at Ben. The fog of shock was gone, burned away by a cold, clear rage. I knew what my father had kept. I knew where he kept it. They have the office, I said, my voice quiet, hard. But they don't know the house. I locked eyes with Ben. The new security team, they're just at the gate. And the barn, Ben said, seeing where I was going. They're just protecting the assets. They don't know the property. Ben, I said, my heart starting to pound a new, sharp rhythm of a fight. Do you still have your old keys to the farmhouse, the ones my dad gave you? Ben looked at me, and for the first time all morning, a slow, grim smile touched the corner of his mouth. Your dad and I built that safe behind the wall panel in '98. I've still got the key, and I remember the combination. The Liberty Creek High School auditorium was a tinderbox. Every seat was full, the aisles were packed, and a thick, humid anger radiated off the standing room-only crowd. It felt less like a town hall and more like a public execution. At the front, sitting at a long table beneath the stage, was the enemy. Ms. Jenner, in her sharp, soulless suit, was flanked by two slick PR men, and next to her, looking smug and confident, in his role as the grieving savior, was my Uncle Marcus. He was scanning the crowd, but his eyes slid right past me and Maya, standing in the back, as if we were just part of the angry wallpaper. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the new American town square, a place where our future would be decided by a projector and a zoning petition. My phone was heavy in my pocket. Maya and I had come straight here, but Ben was moving. As the town council president droned on about rules of order, my mind was with Ben, picturing him slipping through the overgrown north orchard, a shadow in the twilight. He knew the new security team was focused on the front gate and the main barn, protecting the assets. He didn't care about the assets. He was going for the truth. While Ms. Jenner was introduced, Ben was already at the farmhouse, his old worn key sliding into the back door lock. The click of the tumbler felt deafening in the silence. He slipped inside. The house was cold, musty. Marcus had abandoned it for his flashy new condo in town, and it felt like a museum full of my father's ghosts. He went straight to the old office. He didn't bother with the desk. He knew Marcus would have cleaned it out. He went to the wall, to the framed photo of my dad, and him holding up a prize-winning apple from 1998. He lifted the frame, revealing the small, nearly invisible seam of the wall panel. He worked the combination lock, the tumblers falling into place with a quiet snick. The heavy little door swung open. Inside, untouched, was the small fireproof safe. He pulled out the thick, leather-bound ledger, the real one. He opened it, and there it was, page after page of neat, precise bookkeeping. Profit, a banner year. A banner. He dug deeper. Tucked beneath the ledger was a stack of thin, foreign-looking bank statements. Cayman Islands, a numbered account, and then the final damning paper, a wire transfer receipt from a global Bev subsidiary to that same offshore account dated 3 days ago. Payoff. He laid them out on the floor, his hands shaking so hard the first few photos were a blur, but he got them. Clear, undeniable. My phone buzzed a single sharp vibration. I pulled it out under the cover of the crowd's grumbling. A text from Ben. Got him. And now, the council president said Ms. Jenner, representing Global Bev, will outline the Project Cider Mill proposal. Ms. Jenner stood her heels clicking on the linoleum, and a PowerPoint flashed to life on the big screen behind her. It was all slick graphics and empty words. Jobs. Progress. A new era of prosperity for Liberty Creek. Synergy. Community partnership. The crowd wasn't buying it. A low hiss of boos and sarcastic laughter followed every corporate buzzword. She finished her soulless presentation and nodded to Marcus. And now a man you all know. Mr. Marcus Vance, who made the difficult but necessary choice to secure this town's future. Marcus stood his face a mask of false piety. He held the microphone, pretending his hand was shaking. My friends, my neighbors, he began, his voice thick. This was the hardest decision of my life. He paused for effect. But the books, God help me, the books were a mess. He was looking right at me now, a flicker of challenge in his eyes. My niece, Rachel, she has the heart, but not the head for it. We were bleeding money. I had a choice, let my brother's legacy crumble into dust or make the hard call. I did this to save our family's legacy. I did this to save us. That was it. The air rushed out of my lungs, replaced by a white-hot singular rage. Before Maya could even touch my arm, I was moving. I'd like to ask a question. My voice cut through the auditorium like a knife. Every head turned. The sudden absolute silence was deafening. Marcus's practiced sad smile froze on his face. He hadn't expected me to be here. Maya was right behind me as I walked down the center aisle, the crowd parting for me like water. I could feel the heat of 100 pairs of eyes. I stopped 10 feet from the table. My name is Rachel Vance, I said, my voice shaking but loud. And that is my legacy you're talking about. Marcus's face paled. Rachel, this isn't the time or place. Mr. Vance. Maya's voice cut in all business. She was already at the side of the stage, plugging my phone into the projector's auxiliary cable. You stated the company was failing, is that correct? That you were bleeding red ink? Marcus licked his lips, looking to Ms. Jenner, who was suddenly looking at her own phone with furious intensity. Yes, that's correct. The numbers, they were catastrophic. That's funny, Maya said. The projector flickered, and Ms. Jenner's slick corporate graphic was replaced by a crystal-clear photo of my father's ledger. The column was highlighted. Because these ledgers from your father's private safe show a 20% profit year over year. They show your best September in a decade. A collective roaring gasp filled the room. The numbers were there, undeniable, on a 10-foot screen. Marcus was sputtering. That's not... Those aren't the real... No, I said, stepping forward, taking the phone from Maya's hand. Then maybe this is. I clicked to the next image. The wire transfer, the Global Bev logo, the numbered account in the Cayman Islands. You lied, I said, my voice trembling with a year's worth of pain and rage. You lied about everything. You didn't sell our legacy to save it. You sold it to pay your gambling debts. The room exploded. It wasn't a gasp this time. It was a roar. People were on their feet shouting, Thief! You sold us out! Get him! My uncle's face had gone from white to a sickly mottled gray. He looked to Miss Jenner for help, for a lifeline, but her face was pure venom. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at him, not with anger for his crime, but with pure, unadulterated contempt for getting caught. I walked right up to the table, my hands flat on its surface, leaning in so only he could hear me. You used my father's trust to destroy his life's work. I whispered the words, shaking. Then I stood up straight and turned to the crowd, my voice breaking but carrying over the din. He sold out our family. He sold out this town. That was all it took. the council president, his face ashen with panic, began slamming his gavel. Order! Order! This hearing is tabled. The zoning application is suspended effective immediately. Suspended pending a full criminal investigation. In the chaos, Ms. Jenner and her PR team were already gone, sweeping out a side door like rats fleeing a fire. A PR and legal nightmare. Marcus was left alone at the table, exposed, the spotlight hitting his terrified, guilty face. The shouting hadn't stopped, but as I turned, I saw a new movement. Ben Carter was standing at the main auditorium doors. Two of our other former staff, the ones who'd been fired by email that morning, were blocking the other exits. They weren't moving, they were just waiting. Waiting for the sheriff whose sirens I could now hear wailing in the distance. The night of the town hall didn't end. It just bled into the next day and the day after that. Liberty Creek was buzzing, a hive kicked by a boot. The high school auditorium had become a war room. My name, which had been a whisper of gossip 3 days ago, was now a rallying cry. Maya in her element was a whirlwind of legal fury. She didn't just file a lawsuit, she filed a comprehensive multi-count civil action that made my head spin. It was Rachel Vance and the Liberty Creek Preservation Alliance, a name she'd created overnight, with half the town signed on as members, versus Marcus Vance Global Bev Corporation and 10 John Does she'd added as placeholders for anyone else involved. The charges were brutal, fraudulent conveyance conspiracy to commit fraud, gross breach of fiduciary duty, and a request for an immediate injunction to void the sale. The evidence from the town hall, Ben's photos, the ledgers, the offshore account was attached as Exhibit A. It was all so public, so clean, that the state attorney general, who was facing re-election and loved a good David and Goliath story, held a press conference. Citing brave whistleblowers and overwhelming evidence of criminal malfeasance, his office was opening its own case against Marcus. The criminal charges were even simpler: wire fraud, embezzlement. Global Bev, it turned out, hated a fair fight. Even more, they hated bad press. A multinational corporation being run out of a high school auditorium by a 28-year-old in a flannel shirt wasn't just a legal problem, it was a PR nightmare. They didn't even wait for the lawsuit to be served. Less than 48 hours after Ms. Jenner had fled the stage, their response came not from a lawyer, but from their corporate communications department. It was a masterpiece of soulless damage control. They were appalled and deeply misled. They had entered into the agreement in good faith, relying on the assurances of our local partner, Mr. Marcus Vance, who had assured them of his full legal authority and the financial insolvency of the business. They were shocked to learn of his alleged self-dealing. Effective immediately, they were withdrawing their application with the county and initiating their own legal proceedings to nullify the sale and recoup all associated losses. They wished the Vance family well. Just like that, they cut him loose, threw him under the bus, and backed the bus over him to make sure. They were gone. The threat of the super plant was gone. The cidery legally was back in limbo, but it was my limbo. The town celebrated. I just felt empty, exhausted. The adrenaline that had been fueling me for days drained away, leaving a hollow, aching space. The fight wasn't over, it was just changing. Marcus made bail. His Portland lawyer must have been good, and 2 days later he found me. I was back at the Liberty Bell Diner in the same booth, trying to eat my first real meal in a week. The bell over the door jangled and a cold draft hit my back. The diner went silent. Not angry, just watchful. I looked up. It was Marcus. I had never seen him look like this. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by wrinkled slacks and a cheap polo shirt. His face was gray papery, his eyes bloodshot and darting. He looked pathetic. He looked like a ghost. He slid into the booth opposite me, his hands trembling so badly he had to hide them in his lap. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Rach, you've got to stop this. Stop Maya. Call off the AG." I just looked at him. I didn't have any words. "They're going to send me to prison." He choked out, a single greasy tear tracking down his unshaven cheek. "Prison, Rachel. For For a mistake. A business mistake. A mistake. My voice was as quiet as his, but it was cold. You stole my father's company. You tried to ruin my life. I was desperate, he hissed, leaning forward, his eyes wild. You don't understand the pressure, the people I owed. But I can fix it, I can. I can pay it back, somehow. But you have to help me. Your family, Rachel, family helps each other. Your dad would have helped me. That was it. That was the last poisoned arrow he had, and he'd just fired it. He was trying to use my father's memory, the very memory he'd desecrated, as a shield. I'd expected to feel rage. I'd expected to feel that hot, white-hot fury from the town hall. I'd even expected to feel pity, the old familiar pull to fix things, to smooth things over. I felt nothing. Just a vast, cold, sad clarity. The last tie between us, the one woven from shared blood and childhood memories, had been so utterly dissolved by his choices that there was nothing left to even be angry at. He was just a man I used to know. You stopped being family? I said, my voice steady, when you stood in my father's office and used the trust he gave you to sign a deal with his enemies. You stopped being family when you plotted to turn his legacy into a parking lot to cover your gambling debts. And you really stopped being family, I added, my voice dropping, when you sat on that stage and used his name to justify your crimes to a whole town. He stared at me, his mouth open, the plea dying in his throat. He had no more moves. My father would have been ashamed of you, I said. He is ashamed of you. This isn't about me anymore, Marcus. This isn't even about the money. This is about what you did to this town, to my staff, and to his memory. I stood up, pulling a $5 bill from my pocket and dropping it on the table for the coffee I'd barely touched. You're right about one thing. You are going to prison. He just sat there, a broken gray man in a vinyl booth, his world collapsed to the size of a diner table. I turned my back on him. I didn't look back as I pushed open the diner door, the bell jangling my exit. I walked out into the cold, clean autumn air, and for the first time in my life I felt truly, completely, and terribly free. The keys didn't feel like a victory. They were just cold, sharp-edged pieces of metal in a manila envelope that Maya's paralegal had unceremoniously dropped on my diner table. The injunction was final. The sale voided, and the property, by order of a very stressed-out county judge, was mine again. I drove up the gravel road, my hands shaking, as I put the real key into the new padlock the bank's repo team had slapped on the gate weeks ago. It clicked open. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt numb. I parked the truck by the main barn and sat for a long time just listening. The silence was wrong. It wasn't the peaceful working quiet of an orchard. It was the dead hollow silence of a graveyard. No hum from the refrigeration units, no clinking of the bottling line, no distant rumble of Ben's tractor. Just the wind, and it sounded lonely. I got out. The air didn't smell like apples and sawdust. It smelled like dust and rot. I walked the property alone, my boots kicking up dry leaves. The victory I'd won at the town hall felt like a lifetime ago. That was a fight. This was an autopsy. I forced myself to slide open the heavy door to the bottling barn. The transition team from Global Bev had been here. They hadn't smashed anything, they'd been worse. They had been clinically efficient. They had scoured the place. Every stainless steel tank, thousands of gallons of our best aging cider, my father's cider, had been drained. The taps left open, a faint, vinegary tang in the air, the only evidence it had ever existed. A thick uniform layer of dust covered the bottling line, the green conveyor belt still and silent. My dad's prized antique tractor, the one he'd restored by hand, had a bright red, official-looking "Do not operate, unsafe" tag wired to the steering wheel. They had winterized the entire operation in the middle of October, a death sentence for a working cidery. But the real horror, the thing that buckled my knees, was outside. I walked into the orchard, into the rows my great-grandfather had planted. And I stopped. In the few critical weeks they'd held the land while the lawyers argued, they hadn't tended a single thing. The fall weeds given free rein had exploded. Thick, thorny thistles and invasive grasses choked the base of every tree, a tangled, rusty brown mat. The last of the apples, the ones we should have been harvesting, had fallen. They lay rotting on the ground in a sweet, sickening mush, attracting swarms of angry, buzzing yellow jackets. It was a wasteland. And I knew from Maya's last grim phone call it was all I had. After the state unfroze the business accounts, we'd finally gained access. Marcus hadn't just taken out a few bad loans. He'd been systematic. He'd liquidated everything. Every business checking account, every payroll fund, every dollar of profit from the Harvest Fest, every emergency line of credit. It was all gone, funneled into that black hole of his debt before he got caught. He'd left me a corpse. I had won back a shell, a beautiful, historic, deeply loved shell, that was completely, utterly, and hopelessly broke. I was standing in the ruins of my life, the sole owner of a dead orchard and a mountain of debt. I walked back into the empty bottling barn. The late afternoon sun was slanting through the dusty windows, illuminating the dead line, the empty vats. The silence was absolute. The weight of it all, the fight, the betrayal, the town hall, and now this, the empty hollow. Nothing that was left, it finally broke me. I wasn't a warrior. I wasn't a hero. I was just a girl alone in a barn with nothing left to fight for. I slid down the cold, unfeeling steel of the nearest vat until I hit the concrete floor. I put my head in my hands and I wept. Not the hot, angry tears of the town hall, but a deep, racking, hopeless despair that echoed in the vast, empty room. I had won, and I had lost everything. I don't know how long I sat there, a crumpled heap on the floor. The golden light had turned to a dusty, melancholy blue when the heavy barn door scraped open, the sound echoing like a gunshot. I flinched, my whole body tensing, trying to wipe the snot and tears from my face. Ben Carter stood there, a dark, solid shape against the twilight. He didn't look surprised to find me on the floor. He didn't rush over or ask if I was okay. He just walked in his heavy work boots, echoing, and sat down on a stack of overturned pallets. Not too close, but not far. He just sat with me in the cold, dusty silence for 5, maybe 10 minutes. Finally, he bent down his knees, cracking, and picked up a single dry apple leaf from the floor. He turned it over in his large, calloused hands. "It's not dead, Rach," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "It's just sleeping. Trees are good at that. They know how to wait for the spring." I went home. I don't remember the drive. I slept a dead, dreamless sleep. But when I woke up, his words were still there. "It's just sleeping." I got up. I found my old pruning shears, the ones with the worn, smooth wooden handles that had been my dad's. I sat on the porch and sharpened the blade until it gleamed. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have any money. I just knew I had to cut back the weeds. I was the only one left. I drove back to the cidery, the sun just a weak promise in the east. I parked, got out, walked to the first tree in the first row and just started. Snip, snip, snip. The sound was tiny, sharp, and achingly lonely in the vast, quiet orchard. I'd been at it for maybe an hour, my back already aching, my hands raw when I heard it. A low rumble. Not my truck. It was getting closer. I looked up, annoyed, wiping sweat from my eyes. And I froze. Ben's old blue Ford was pulling up the drive, and behind him, Maya's little silver Subaru. And behind her, the Liberty Bell Diner's catering van. And behind that, a half-dozen other trucks, rattling and coughing trucks I recognized from the town hall. They parked, doors slamming, a small army in flannel and Carhartt. And people just got out. Maya in jeans and brand new work boots, holding a pair of garden gloves like she was afraid of them. Ben hauling a chainsaw from his truck bed. Sal and Maria from the diner already setting up a table with massive urns of coffee and boxes of donuts. Then the others, a dozen families carrying their own tools. Rakes, shears, weed whackers. 2 men I barely knew were driving tractors. They just showed up. I just stood there, my stupid little shears, hanging uselessly at my side, my mouth open. Ben walked over, his face grim but his eyes kind. He handed me a steaming styrofoam cup. "Thought you could use a hand," he said simply. I couldn't speak. I just looked at him, at the crowd at the orchard, and the tears started again, but they were different. They were hot, and they were full. "All right, folks," Ben bellowed, turning to the crowd which was already fanning out. "This thing's asleep. Let's wake it up." For a solid week they came, a modern-day barn raising. No one asked for pay. They took time off their own jobs. They swarmed the orchard, and the sound of snip, snip, snip was replaced by a roar of saws, whirring, and laughter. Inside, a different crew, led by a terrifyingly organized Maya, scrubbed every vat, cleaned every line, and repainted the walls. Maria and Sal fed everyone potluck lunches, appearing on long tables at noon. On the last day, a sleek, quiet car I didn't recognize pulled up. A man in a suit got out. It was Mr. Henderson, the president of the Liberty Creek Bank. He looked at the pruned trees, at the gleaming barn, at the 3 dozen sweaty, exhausted, smiling people. He looked at me. "Rachel?" he said, adjusting his tie. "I've been watching this." He cleared his throat, looking almost embarrassed. "The bank's board had a meeting last night. All this, well, we call it sweat equity. And there's a hell of a lot of it here. We can't let Global Bev have the last word." He held out a business card. "You come and see me tomorrow. The bank would be proud to offer the new, whatever you're calling it, a full low-interest line of credit to get the new harvest bottled. You've all earned it." I looked at Ben. I looked at Maya. I looked at my town. And I finally understood. I wasn't just my father's daughter. I was one of them. The winter was brutal, but we were too busy to notice. The bank's loan was a lifeline, but the community's belief was the fuel. We didn't just rebuild, we reimagined. The word "I" slowly, naturally faded from my vocabulary and was replaced by "we." Those long, cold months were a montage of hard, unglamorous work. We weren't just fixing what was broken. We were building something new from the ground up. Ben, Maya, and I spent late nights hunched over my kitchen table, buried in paperwork, restructuring the entire business. It wasn't just Vance Family Cidery anymore. That name, that legacy was complicated, now tinged with my uncle's betrayal. When we reopened in the spring, it was with a new sign over the gate, one carved from local oak by the high school shop class. Liberty Creek Community Co-op. The idea had been Maya's illegal stroke of genius. We offered micro-investments open to any resident of the county. For as little as $100, you could own a piece of the cidery. It wasn't about raising capital. It was about solidifying the alliance. It was a promise. Never again could one person sell out the whole town. Now the town was the business, and people bought in. Sal and Maria from the diner, the mechanics, the teachers, the farmers, they bought shares not as an investment but as a statement. The last loose thread was snipped on a rainy Tuesday in March. I was in the tap room refinishing the bar top, the sharp, clean smell of varnish in the air. A small second-hand TV we'd put in the corner was murmuring the local noon news. I was only half listening, focused on the smooth, even strokes of my brush, when I heard the name. Marcus Vance. I stopped, my hand freezing midair. The camera showed a stock photo of him, the one from the Harvest Fest, where he looked so confident and cold. The anchorwoman read the update in a crisp, impersonal voice. Pled guilty this morning to 2 federal counts of wire fraud and 1 state count of embezzlement. In a deal with prosecutors, Mr. Vance was sentenced to 36 months in a low-security federal prison, effective immediately. I watched as his photo was replaced by a weather map. Just like that, 36 months. It wasn't a life sentence, but it was an ending. He was gone. The name that had been a specter, a monster under the bed, was now just a news story. A sad, pathetic, finished story. I felt a small, strange shudder go through me, like a spring uncoiling in my chest. I hadn't realized I was still holding my breath. I let it out a long, slow exhale and went back to sanding the bar. April brought the thaw, and with it a new kind of work. The old choking weeds were gone, but a section of the north orchard, the one closest to where Global Bev had planned their concrete slab, was still a scar. The trees there had been too damaged, too old, too neglected. We'd had to pull them. Today I was replanting. I wasn't alone. Not really. Ben was on his tractor a few fields over, and I could hear the thwack-thwack of a hammer from the barn, but in this patch of earth, it was just me. The air was cool and damp, smelling of new mud and apple blossoms. I knelt in the dark, rich soil my jeans soaked through. I dug the hole my movements practiced strong. My hands, I noticed, looked different. They weren't the hands of a manager anymore. They were my father's hands. The skin was rough, the knuckles calloused, a permanent reddish-brown stain under the nails that no amount of scrubbing could remove. My face, when I caught my reflection in the truck window, was different too. The sun had weathered it, drawing fine lines around my eyes. But I was smiling, a real, quiet, easy smile. I picked up a new sapling, a tiny, hopeful whip of a tree. I fanned its roots, settled it into the earth, and packed the soil firmly around its base. I was no longer just Rachel Vance, my father's daughter, desperately trying to keep his ghost happy, to live up to a legacy I'd inherited. And I was certainly not Marcus's victim, the girl who'd been locked out and broken. I was just Rachel, a leader, a partner, a grower, a woman who knew the weight of a shovel and the price of a lie. This was my agency. This was my freedom. It wasn't something I'd been given. It was something I'd clawed out of the dirt with my own hands, surrounded by my community. I stood up, brushing the mud from my knees, and looked at the row of new fragile saplings. It was a start. It was my foundation. 1 year. One full, hard-fought, transformative year. The air was crisp again, smelling of pressed apples, and this time the savory smoke from a dozen different potluck barbecues. It was the harvest fest, but it was ours. The slick corporate veneer of the last few years was gone. There were no rented stages, no overpriced vendor tents, no sense of performing for an audience. It was smaller, louder, more beautifully chaotic. It was a family reunion. Kids were running wild through the rows of trees, their laughter echoing, while their parents shared blankets and passed around growlers of our new first-run cider. The new sign at the gate, the one carved from local oak, gleamed in the afternoon sun: Liberty Creek Community Co-op. I stood on the farmhouse porch, the old wood solid beneath my boots. My hands were gripping a small, handwritten note card, but I wasn't looking at it. My heart was thudding, a nervous, happy rhythm against my ribs. Ben, looking proud in a clean flannel shirt, finished setting up the small, simple speaker and gave me a nod. He stepped back to join Maya, who was leaning against a porch post, a sharp proprietary smile on her face. The murmur of the crowd died down. A few hundred faces, friends, neighbors, partners, all turned toward me. I took a deep breath, the sweet, sharp air filling my lungs, and stepped up to the microphone. "Welcome home, everyone," I said, and my voice, though it trembled slightly, carried over the crowd. I raised my glass, the new cider inside a beautiful, clear amber. "A year ago," I said, my voice gaining strength, "on this very land we were told that this place, our home, was just an asset, that it was just numbers on a spreadsheet to be bought and sold by men in boardrooms who had never set foot here." I saw heads nodding. I saw Sal and Maria from the diner holding hands. I saw the families who had shown up with tractors and pruning shears, their faces set in the same stubborn pride I felt. "We were told this place was failing," I continued, "that one man's greed was a hard decision. We were told our legacy was worthless." I paused, letting the memory of that cold gray morning hang in the air for just a second. Then I smiled. "You all proved them wrong." A cheer started low and rumbling, and then grew a wave of sound that washed over the orchard and back again. I had to wait for it to die down, my own cheeks aching from the grin I couldn't stop. "You came with shears and saws, with coffee and with kindness. You worked, you fought, you invested, and you rebuilt. You proved that this isn't just a business, it's our home." The cheer came again, louder this time, less a celebration and more a defiant roar. I looked over at Ben, his eyes suspiciously bright, and at Maya, who was actually properly beaming. What my uncle and Global Bev never understood, I said, my voice dropping but clear, is that you can't buy a community, you can't put a price on this. I held my glass high. This isn't one man's legacy anymore, this is our future. The roar was deafening. Glasses were raised all across the lawn. I saw people hugging, laughing, even a few crying. My own eyes were burning. I raised my glass to my lips. I'd thought about calling this first batch the bitter harvest. A small private joke, but I hadn't. I took a sip. It wasn't bitter. It was strong, sharp, and impossibly sweet, with a clean, bright finish that tasted like hard work and second chances. I'd processed the sorrow. I'd metabolized the outrage. All that was left was this: the warmth of the sun on my face, the sound of my friends' laughter, the taste of something we had all made together. The triumph wasn't a spike of adrenaline. It was a deep, quiet, settled peace. The catharsis wasn't about watching Marcus fall. It was about watching all of us rise. I looked out at the rows of trees, at the new saplings we'd planted, their leaves a vibrant, hopeful green against the old, strong trunks. I was home. I was free. And just like that, the fight was over, replaced by the quiet, steady work of rebuilding. What did you think of Rachel's stand and the way her community rallied behind her? We read every single comment to hear your thoughts. If you love stories of justice and hard-won triumph, be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.